Hi, this is Grant Dietz from Mr. Troutman's History 202 class, and this is my midterm project, and I'm going to be teaching the music of the 1950s. The 1950s was one of the best decades ever for music, and it is one of the most important in music history. From the birth to the biggest stars to the creation of new genres, this was the new era when rock and roll was born, one of the best genres ever to be created, along with other genres like blues, jazz, R&B, and pop. Rock and roll was the staple sound of the 50s. Rock and roll is a broad genre that can be described as loud, energetic, and upbeat. This music is usually going towards a younger audience at the time. Rock is the music of the baby boomer generation. These were the people born after World War II in the later 40s. And they are the reason that rock and roll became so popular, and without them, this genre wouldn't be the same. From rock and roll, other genres were created like hard rock and heavy metal. Rock wasn't only filled with good music and good musicians, but it also helped bring the white and black communities together. This was the time of the civil rights movement when African Americans were fighting for their rights and equality and to end segregation, and rock was a big part of breaking down that wall. Many of the artists at this time were African American, and this is the main reason why rock and roll bridged the gap between the white and black communities. They could find a common interest, and they both loved this music. Artists like Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Chubby Checker, and the Coasters were all founders of rock and roll, and without them, this genre wouldn't even exist. Chuck Berry is one of the all-time greatest rock and roll musicians to ever be alive. He is considered by many the father of rock and roll. His most popular song, Johnny B. Good, came out in 1958 and was a song based around Chuck Berry's life on how he went from a nobody to a superstar. The song was featured in the movie Back to the Future, which came out in 1985, when Marty McFly performed it at his high school's dance. This helped his song become even more popular to different generations of music lovers. Another amazing Chuck Berry song, and a very popular one, is a song called Maybelline, and this is a song about young love. He was an amazing performer, singer, and guitar player, and he inspired so many people from AC/DC's guitar player Angus Young to the king of rock and roll himself as Elvis Presley. Elvis is a legend of legends. He is one of the most recognized musicians throughout all of history and has a nickname, the King. Elvis was 21 years old when he had his first #1 hit on the Billboard charts in 1956 with his song Heartbreak Hotel. He also had many other hits in the 50s like All Shook Up, Blue Suede Shoes, Don't Be Cruel, Jailhouse Rock, Hound Dog, and many, many more. One of the biggest reasons that Elvis became so popular in the 50s was because of his dedication to his music. In the year 1955, he had a performance or an appearance almost every single day throughout the entire year, from playing at high schools, fairs, clubs, theaters, and even talk shows. He became widely known very, very fast. Elvis was very popular towards the younger audience because of his dancing, his clothing style, and his nonconformist attitude. Many adults thought that Elvis was inappropriate with his dancing, and they thought it was obscene, inappropriate, and they thought it was too sexual. Even Ed Sullivan didn't want Elvis to come onto his show and perform because he thought he was so inappropriate, but he later changed his mind because Elvis was such a great hit. The reason that Elvis is the king is because he had 108 songs get on the top 100 list throughout his career, and 18 of his songs hit #1. which is an undoubtable reason to be called the king. There was a very common theme throughout the songs in the 1950s, and that was songs about love. This is because the musicians' main audience was the younger generation, and they could connect to love, heartbreak, and relationships. The musical Grease is a good example of this because this is about the love between Danny and Sandy in the 1950s timeline. And throughout that whole musical, you can see examples of 1950s style of music. And dancing is also very popular at this time through the young generation, so musicians would try to make music that they could dance to, created by them. R&B was a sound that came from jazz music in the 40s that turned to an upbeat blues sound in the 50s. And R&B and rock and roll are pretty similar, just a little bit different. The biggest artists from this genre were Frankie Lymon and the Teenagers, Ray Charles, the Drifters, and Lloyd Price. You could almost think of R&B as like rock mixed with pop. It has an upbeat, quick sound that gives a happy feeling. You can't talk about music and music history of the 50s without recognizing two amazing artists, the first being Ritchie Valens. Ritchie Valens is a 17-year-old kid from Southern California who became a sensation all around the country. When he was 16, he joined a band called the Silhouettes, and he was still in high school at the time. He was found at one of his concerts by the head of Delphi Records and was signed to a record deal. Valens mainly played rock and roll music, but he also made a couple other songs in different genres. He had many hits in his career like Come On Let's Go, Donna, and La Bamba. Ritchie Valens was a singer, a songwriter, and a great guitarist. He played across the country with big names like J.P. Richardson, Diane and the Belmonts, and Buddy Holly at just 17 years old. The second name that you should hear about is Buddy Holly. The genre that Buddy Holly was very popular in was a genre called rockabilly, which was a combination of country and rock and roll. When he first started his musical career, he mainly focused towards country, but later changed to rock and roll with his inspiration from Elvis. When he graduated high school, he started his own band that would be called the Crickets. And without his band, the Crickets, there would be no Beatles because the Beatles got their inspiration from them. Buddy Holly opened for many famous people, including Elvis, and that's where he got a lot of his inspiration and looks from and his styles, even though he didn't fit it as well. By the age of 22, he had many hits like Peggy Sue, Every Day, That'll Be the Day, and many, many more songs. Buddy Holly traveled all across the country just as a young kid and was very famous. What connects Ritchie Valens and Buddy Holly is one of the worst days in music history and a very memorable moment in time. Ritchie Valens, Buddy Holly, J.P. Richardson, and Diane and the Belmonts were on a winter tour through the Midwest of the United States. They were having troubles with their tour bus and the heating was broken in it, so they decided to get a plane to make it to their next show so they weren't freezing cold all night. Unfortunately, the plane wasn't big enough to fit everyone, so only 3 of the people on tour were able to go into it, and that included Ritchie Valens, Buddy Holly, and J.P. Richardson. Unfortunately, only a few minutes into their flight, their plane was having trouble and it crashed down into a field only 5 miles away from where they took off. This crash left no survivors, and this is the day that music died. On February 3rd, 1959, this disaster shook the whole country, and it not only affected the music industry, but everyone. Ritchie Valens was only a 17-year-old whose career was only months old. He hadn't even been in the music industry for an entire year. And in that short time, he made so many hits. He went from a kid to a rock star. And Buddy Holly, a 22-year-old, toured with people like Elvis Presley. Both of them were gone too soon, and they could have been huge megastars throughout the entire world, but their time was cut short. Both of them were inducted in the Hall of Fame eventually after this day happened, and that just shows how much of an impact both of them had on music. In 1971, Don McLean memorialized this day when he wrote his song American Pie, which hit #1 on the charts. This is the most single important and sad moment in all of music history, and especially the 50s. This day will never be forgotten, and if you wish to learn more about this day and about Ritchie Valens especially, there's a movie called La Bamba that was made, and it portrays Ritchie's life story and his musical career very accurately. Even if you aren't the biggest fan of music from the 50s, it is still important to understand and realize that without the music from back then, we wouldn't have the same music we have today. All the music we have today was inspired by music like rock and roll and R&B. It is important to realize that the African Americans were a huge and important role in the 50s with creating music, and without them, we wouldn't have the music we had today. They inspired blues, jazz, rock, R&B, and many genres we have today. The best of the best came from this decade, from Elvis to Chuck Berry, and there's still big influences to many artists today, and many people still enjoy them all throughout time. To finish off, this is my works cited. The first two are from a biography website, and they just basically told the biographies of Buddy Holly and Ritchie Valens. And that's where I got a lot of information and facts from. And then the third source was my article that I found on my academic journal. And then the fourth one, I got that from a Rolling Stone website, and I just use that because the Rolling Stones is basically just talks about music, so I knew that they were pretty accurate on what they were talking about. And then the last two just had a lot of facts and interesting things that I liked. Thank you for listening.